Hey everyone, welcome to this episode with Philip Ball. Philip's a science writer, and throughout his career he's contributed to a wide range of scientific magazines, including Nature and New Scientist. He's released a number of his own books as well, on topics from different kinds of minds, which is his most recent book, to a biography of water, to one also on how to grow a human. And if you check him out on YouTube, you'll see that for the Royal Institution, he delivered a few lectures, which have totaled a couple million of views. So Philip has a wide range of knowledge and he's a really fascinating character. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. And if you do, please hit subscribe because it really helps to grow the channel if you can do that. And yeah, thank you for watching. Phil, thanks for joining me.
A pleasure, thank you.
So Phil, if we go back to your early life, I was wondering if you could maybe remember the first time you kind of felt really excited or fascinated by science.
I guess I have been for as long as I can remember. I mean, I was one of those kids who could sort of do it. You know, I found I was good at maths, and if that was the case, and I'm talking about the late 60s here, then you'd kind of be pushed in that direction anyway. At that time, there were virtually popular science didn't exist as a genre. So, you know, there were very few books that you could get as a child to find out about science. But I do remember some that I found. There was one back then, I'm pretty sure, about black holes. You know, all kids love black holes. But even back then, God knows who wrote it. But there was also Martin Gardner's books. Martin Gardner, wrote a lot about maths, but also about science more generally. And I remember one of his books, I think it was the one called The Ambidextrous Universe, which was about left and right and where the asymmetry of left and right comes from. So this was probably in the early 70s. And, so I loved stuff like that, but it was hard to find. There were virtually no TV programs. There was kind of Tomorrow's World. I guess Horizon was sort of going by that stage. But very little, really. So if you did like science, you really had to sort of root about and find it back then.
Were you satisfied with what you were learning at school, or were you, like you say, kind of reading this extra stuff outside? I know it wasn't that accessible then, lots of stuff, but yeah, how were you teaching yourself when you were younger?
I was learning stuff outside. My parents kind of picked up at a fairly early stage that that was an interest I had, and so I remember I was either 10 or 11. They sent me on a course to learn computing, and it was somewhere. I grew up on the Isle of Wight, and it was somewhere around Windsor that they sent me. And I'm so glad that they did, because it meant I've had an experience of computing that seems even to me now like complete ancient history. These were in the days when computers filled the whole room. You were never actually, we were taken on a tour of the computer, but this was the amazing thing that we hardly ever saw. And we went up to learn programming. So there's me and a bunch of, a dozen other kids. And we called it programming then. It wasn't coding, it was programming. And it meant writing out in one of the very early programming languages, like Cecil or something, writing out your program down, by hand on paper. And then we'd send it off to the technicians who'd turn it into punched cards. And then those cards, you'd get a stack of cards, and then the technicians would feed that into the computer overnight. And we'd come back the next morning to get the results printed out on this sheet. And you'd see all the bugs in the program and you'd have to debug it. So it was, amazing to have had that very early experience of what computing was like. So things like that, were possible. And clearly that made an impact, because I remember it all very, very clearly now. And I know that at a later stage, when computers started to become more available, and you had the BBC Micro and so on in the 80s, this would be in the late 70s. So I would stay on after school with a friend to, figure out how to calculate pi to how many ever decimal places. It was that kind of thing. It was classic nerdy stuff that I do as a kid, as well as, in chemistry, I guess it was really, I would just pilfer things from the school chemistry lab, bring them home and do experiments at home, to my mum and dad's consternation. So yeah, it was that sort of classic thing that, kids like me would do outside of lessons to, further their interest.
Was anyone in your family a scientist or a writer or a journalist?
Not really, no, none of them. I mean, my maternal grandfather, he worked as kind of as a an analytic chemist for the gas board in the Midlands. That's where my parents were from. But I barely knew him. He was very kind of reclusive. He was actually, his passion was nature photography, and he took fantastic pictures of birds and fungi and so on. But I can't honestly say that was an influence, because, he died when I was still fairly young, and I didn't really know him before then anyway. So no, they weren't. And my eldest brother and I were really the first from our family, our wider family, to go to university. So it wasn't, an academic family. I sort of figured that I was very much finding my own way with it.
Were there any particular scientists or writers that really inspired you when you were younger?
Well, as I say, I do remember Martin Gardner's stuff, but as I say, there didn't seem to be much beyond that. So it's kind of, that's a hard one to answer, because for young people, we didn't really sort of have much to go on or have much to come across. So it was you had to sort of conduct that exploration, or certainly, someone like me, just went to the local comprehensive school that didn't have a lot of resources, so you had to sort of find your own way. I think it's probably fairer to say that I've always been interested in writing, and I was more inspired by fiction writers generally, and I'd always done it. I was one of these kids that sort of wrote a novel at, age 10 or something. And it had never occurred to me, and no one had ever suggested to me, that actually you could combine these two things. This comes much later, when I suddenly realised, hey, maybe I can do writing, which I've always done and always enjoyed, and do science, and put them together. But that was never a career option. That was never something I imagined. I'd always imagined, given this sort of interest that I had, that I would somehow, have a career in science of some sort.
What were some of those experiments you did at home, and what was that novel about when you were 10 years old? I'm intrigued to look a little bit more at these things.
Well, the novel was a complete rip-off, as they always are at that age, a complete rip-off of the Moomin Troll books, the Moomin books. Those were absolutely an influence on me in so many ways, because I still feel, they're recognised as children's classics now, but in the sense that they had something I could always tell, I think, even from an early age, that there was something much deeper going on in Tove Jansson's work that took it beyond what children's books, certainly at that stage, and I think at any time, generally talk about. The same was true, actually, of the Earthsea series by Ursula Le Guin. That I read them, and I just knew there was something deeper. There was something kind of adult here underneath what was going on. I couldn't have articulated what it was, but I could tell. So those books really excited me. But the experiments. They were, the classic ones. So, I discovered at school that you can make an explosive and quite easily by combining iodine and ammonia, and you get nitrogen triiodide, and it's a contact explosive. So you make it sort of precipitates out. You mix the two things together, and they were fairly readily available ingredients then. Mix them together, and then you filter this stuff that precipitates out on filter paper and let it dry, and it's a sort of browny residue. And you just have to touch it with your hand or your finger, and it goes off with a bang, and it's really quite a significant bang, and iodine is produced, and I remember at one point doing this, and it was a bang that I really felt in my hand, and you had sort of iodine stains on my finger. So all of that stuff I loved. We were allowed, my friends and I, to do experiments in the school lab. At lunchtime we could just go up there, and so being complete idiots, at that age, we thought, hey, let's try and nitrate toluene and make TNT. Let's see if we can do that. And so, fortunately, we didn't succeed in that. It's actually harder to try to nitrate toluene to the degree that you can make TNT, but we gave it a try. But there were also things like, I still remember being allowed, I guess, at school to stick my finger into a bowl of mercury. And, that's something that these days you wouldn't be allowed to do because of the dangers of toxicity. But actually, if you're careful about it, it's not such a big deal as long as you're not sort of swigging the stuff back. And it's a real shame if kids aren't, able to have that experience now, because I still remember that so strongly as well, that the feeling of this liquid metal, it's, weirdly dense. You put your finger in, it's a liquid, it doesn't wet, your finger comes out dry because mercury doesn't wet it, and it is the most unearthly stuff. I think it was really those kinds of experiments that brought out the sensual aspect of chemistry in particular. It's such a sort of sensual science. You have the smells, you have the colours, and you have the tactile sensations. And I think it was that, as much as anything else, that made me want to go on and study chemistry at university.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, you went and did that at Oxford. Was it those experiments then that excited you and made you want to pursue that at university?
It was partly that, and it was partly the usual thing that I had inspiring chemistry teachers. All of my science teachers at school were great, but in particular, I had 3 chemistry teachers at various stages, and I remember them all. So they were. I'll name them because we should name our teachers and remember them. So there was Colin McCarthy, there was Kit Heisman, and there was Peter Walker. And they had very different styles, but somehow all 3 of them really sort of inspired me to want to know about chemistry. And so, I think it's, so many people say this, not just in science, but in whatever they've chosen to do, that it's the teachers that they had at that early stage that really determined their, the path they took, and that was absolutely true for me.
You then switched over to physics though when you did your PhD. Is that right, at Bristol Uni?
Yes.
What inspired that kind of switch?
Well, it was, there are many areas where physics and chemistry overlap, and it's not easy to say, is this physics or is this chemistry? And the course at Oxford still, in fact, is a 4-year course, because you have what's called a part 2. So you take the normal course and you take your exams, your finals, and then there's a year of research. It's like a sort of mini PhD, and that was by far the bit that I enjoyed most. And it's independent learning. You have a supervisor. My supervisor was Bob Thomas at Oxford, and his work was neutron scattering. So he would probe stuff, surfaces in particular, by firing beams of neutrons at them and seeing how they bounce off, and by looking at what happens to the neutrons when they bounce off, how much energy they lose or gain, you can work out the stuff that they've interacted with. That's really at the borderline of physics and chemistry. It's really sort of chemical physics, I suppose some would say. So I really enjoyed that. Then when I left Oxford, I was always determined that I was going to be with my rock band for a couple of years, and that's what I did. So we just spent a couple of years as a rock band, gigging around the country. And there came a time, as I always thought there would, as I was doing that. It was an amazing time. It was great. It was all sorts of things. But I always knew that if I wanted to pursue science further, then there was going to be a limit on how long I could be a rock musician before I kind of, lost it. So I contacted Bob at Oxford and said, look, I think I'd like to do a PhD. Is there anyone you could recommend? And he said, there's this guy, another Bob Evans at Bristol, who was also working, in some sense on surface science. But he was in the physics department, and he was doing it much more from the sort of perspective of a physicist. And so he said, give him a try. So I contacted Bob Evans and went up for an interview, hitched up. I had absolutely no money as a, musician. We literally had no money. So I hitched up to Bristol in a lorry and had the interview with Bob, and, we got on well. And that was that. So it meant that, I was now going to be in the physics department doing my PhD, which was a real challenge. I mean, for the first few months, really, I felt, I don't know if I can do this. There was so much learning to do, because it's not just about the PhD material that I had to learn. It's the whole sort of background physics that I really hadn't covered, and other stuff as well, because as a postgrad, we had to know about sort of physics more generally. So I had to learn quantum mechanics in much more depth, and that was really, really challenging. So it was tough switching from chemistry to physics, but I'm so glad that I did it, because it's been so useful to have had exposure to, both of those physical sciences.
Yeah, that sounds tough. I didn't know about this musical period you had. So how many years were you in the band after your undergrad before the PhD?
It was basically 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah. And we were based in Southampton, and it was again in the days when it was possible to do this, when having no money but claiming benefits, it was possible to find somewhere to live and to just have enough money to sort of feed ourselves more or less, and there was nothing else. I mean, we barely even we didn't have money to go down to the pub like you're probably meant to as a rock band, because we couldn't. But we could do it. That you could get by that way. Whereas now I just don't think it would be feasible, and I think that's such a loss, because it means that anyone who wants to make music, they have to have some kind of independent means of supporting themselves to do that, and it cuts it off for a whole wide swathe of society. So it was a fantastic time, an amazing time, and a frustrating time, and all kinds of things. But I'm very glad I did it.
Do you think during that period do you have real serious thoughts about making that your full-time career, or did you kind of know it was a period that would come to an end, you'd go back to science?
Well, that's my other life, you see. In another life I stayed doing that, and if I had another life, then it would be as a musician. I mean, I was never a brilliant musician, but it's possible to I was never going to be a concert or classical musician, but I was good enough to make my way in a band. And to begin with, I just thought, we'll see how it goes. And it's always very hard, of course, in music business to get anywhere. There were signs of that. There was talk of a record deal. We recorded a session for Radio 1, and that was fantastic. But it was never really clear, what was going to happen. And as I say, I knew that, after about 2 years or so, my chances of getting back into academia, if that's what I wanted to do, were going to get progressively slimmer. So yeah, I kind of knew that at some point that decision would come up.
I suppose I think now, I believe the name of it is The Music Instinct. Is that right? You wrote a book?
Yeah.
I guess it inspired that later on.
In a sense, in that music is something I've always done and always been passionate about. And the Music Instinct came about because I wanted to find a way of writing about music from the perspective of what I did. And, in a sense, this was the obvious way. It was a book about how our brains make sense of music. And it's astonishing that they do, because it's such a complex thing that you get this incredibly complex it's just acoustic waves coming at us. Somehow our brain sorts that out into different instruments, into structures, and something that's coherent and that makes sense to us, and something that excites us and excites the emotions. How does it do that? It's just sound. What's going on to create that? So that's really what that book was about. And I kind of, it was also partly, there was a bit of frustration I felt that every time you tended to hear about the science of music, it would be about things like harmonics, the harmonic series. It'd be the mathematical aspects of acoustics, really. And although that's all very interesting, it didn't seem to me to be getting at the core of what it is about music that excites us, why we have this, passion, and have always had this passion culturally for music. Every culture that we know of on earth has music of a sort. So I really wanted to try to get beyond the sort of mathematical aspects of music or sound and to delve into the cultural, the social, the historical, and the kind of genuinely musical, the sort of performance aspects of it, all from the point of view of what it's doing cognitively.
If you can, in any kind of short and simplified form, explain what you found out during that research of why music affects us the way it does, what would you say?
Well, it is complicated because there are so many things going on, but in a sense, I think that's the key, that this complex signal that we receive has so many ways in to our brain that we pick up on rhythm, and there's something about that seems intrinsically to excite. It excites the body. We can't resist tapping our feet or moving our body to it, and that's the rhythmic aspect. You've got the melodic aspect, so what the tune is doing, really. How do we make sense of that? Tunes have particular sort of trajectories and dynamics that create a sort of an emotional journey. You have the harmonic aspects, so what the chords are doing, and that's really interesting because that takes us on a journey through. We all have, I don't just mean musicians, although they have this more strongly, but everyone who enjoys music has a kind of mental map of harmonic space, even if we have no music training at all, of sort of how chords fit together. Intuitively, we literally have a map of that in our brain, and as a piece of music unfolds, the progression, the harmonic progression of where the chords are going, it's like we're taking a journey through that space, and that's really what music is doing. It's taking us on this journey in many different dimensions at once, these different aspects of music. And what we're doing, what it's really tapping into, is the pattern-seeking instinct of our brain. That's why I called it the music instinct, because what we do have an instinct for is to seek patterns in nature. And there's clearly an adaptive benefit, a survival benefit in being able to do that, because it helps us anticipate what's coming. That's what's going on in music. We're constantly, subconsciously, we don't know that we're doing it, but we're consciously sort of anticipating what's going to come next in music. And what music does, and what composers and performers do instinctively, is to play with that. Literally to play with it, and sometimes to just subvert it generally, just to give us something that's a little bit unexpected. And it seems that that's a big part of how it engages us emotionally, because this instinct to find patterns has it links into our reward system. So when we make correct predictions about things, we kind of feel a little bit happy with ourselves, and if our expectations are thwarted, there's a little bit of tension there, and that's what music does. It creates those tensions, and then when the payoff finally comes, if it does, we get that release, and there's literally a kind of a neurotransmitter release that gives us pleasure from that. So even, for example, something as simple as the way so many classical pieces just slow down, the so-called rallentando at the end of the piece. What that's doing, we know that final chord is coming. We kind of know what it's going to be. It's going to be the chord, in a piece of tonal music. It's going to be the key chord. So we sort of know that it's coming, but the slowing down just creates a little bit of uncertainty about when. And so there's this slight tension, and then finally it comes, and we're happy, and we get this enjoyment from it. So it's things like that music is doing. That is, it's playing with our expectations in so many ways to create that sense of anticipation and release.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, so kind of back to your story. So after the PhD, how did you come to decide you wanted to get into kind of public science communication? Was that an easy decision?
It was a slightly unexpected one, as I say. It dawned on me with some surprise that actually, I guess the way it came about is that I found that I enjoyed writing up my thesis, my PhD thesis, which most people really don't enjoy. You know, for a lot of people, it's murder to get this thing done. But I enjoyed that process, and I kind of then figured, well, that makes sense because I've always written and I've always enjoyed writing, and I've always kind of written fiction, and I never really connected it to science, but maybe writing is what I like doing. So I thought, well, maybe there is a way into science publishing. I didn't particularly think of writing as such, but maybe sort of editorial work where you're working with words. So I started looking around at the end of my PhD for what might be available, and purely, on spec, I just wrote to Nature, the science journal, to basically, I literally said, you've got any jobs going, and out of sheer good fortune, there was a hole had appeared in Nature that I fitted, in the sense that the editor for one of the editors for physical sciences had just left to set up the magazine Physics World for the Institute of Physics, so they had to replace someone in that position, and I'd trained in physics and chemistry, so I had the right sorts of qualifications, and somehow or another I persuaded the editor I was the right person for the job. And so, I was offered a job at Nature, which is continues to be one of the world's premier scientific journals. So it was a fantastic opportunity, and it was an editor's job. So what it really involved was deciding and selecting which papers Nature would publish. So scientists submit papers to Nature, and the editors have a look at them, figure out whether in principle the paper looks interesting enough and whether it seems suitable for the journal, and then we send it out to referees, specialist referees, who tell us if there's any flaws in the work and how important it is, and then we make a decision about it. So that's what the job consisted of. But being at somewhere like Nature meant that there were opportunities to start doing other stuff, to start writing. So writing for the magazine itself, and also it meant that if I went to a newspaper and said, look, you're interested in me writing a piece about this work, they were more likely to listen, if I was already working as an editor at Nature, than if I was, no one they'd ever heard of. So that helped, and that meant that there were opportunities to do that. So I gradually came to realise that actually, writing about science was what I wanted to do. So it was fantastic working in Nature. It was a huge learning experience, because this was, if anyone knows anything about Nature, it's now a publishing empire with so lots and lots of journals in different disciplines. When I joined in 1988, it was just Nature, the magazine, that was it. And it was a small operation with a small staff, and it meant that as an editor for physical sciences, I could be covering anything. That if one of my colleagues who normally did astronomy and astrophysics was away on holiday, then maybe I'd have to do their papers for a week, or earth sciences or something. So it meant I had to learn about all these areas of science that I'd never trained in, which was challenging but really exciting. So it was a great place to learn, and to learn how to write. I sort of did that on the job. I'd had no journalistic training, but I had to learn how to edit pieces, how to sub-edit, how to do the sort of fine-grained details of going through word by word and figuring out what goes where and whether words were used correctly. So all of that stuff I learned there, and it was a great training ground, and continues to be for people who want to communicate science more generally.
I wanted to understand a little bit about the path your career's taken, because you've written a number of books, you've written for so many publications, you've recorded lots of podcasts and shows. How have you kind of moved about between different organisations, between different work? What's been the kind of path, if you can kind of run us through it a bit? It
feels to me like very much a random walk. I never had any plan for what I was going to do, and as I say, I really only fell into this lucky position at Nature towards the end of my PhD. I just months before I was going to finish, as I recall, I just sort of gave that a go. And while I was there, the more I wrote, the more I realised I wanted to write, and I wrote my first book while working full time at Nature in 1994. Well, I wrote it in 1993, I guess. It came out in 94. And it was great, but it was also hellish because working in Nature was more than a full-time job already, and writing a book as well, it meant I was getting up at 5 a.m. and doing a little bit before I went into work and so on. And so I figured I wanted to do more of that, but I couldn't do it as a full-time Nature editor. So I went part-time, and the rest of the time worked on the second book. And gradually I took on more and more writing and realised actually this is probably what I want to do. And I can never remember exactly when I went freelance. I cut down to working in Nature 1 day a week. And it was sometime, I think, in the early 2000s that I decided, okay, now it's probably time to go freelance. So that's what I did. And that involved, and what it involves now still is a mixture of working on books, so these long-term projects that require a lot of research, and working on much shorter-term journalistic writing. And the two feed each other. So when I'm researching a book, I might well come across stuff that will become an article for somewhere, and when I'm looking out for what's going on in science to write for New Scientist or Scientific American or wherever, that sometimes throws up ideas that might eventually become books. So it's very good to have the two going on together. I also think it's just very good discipline in a way to have with a book. Your deadline is maybe a year or a year and a half away. Sometimes writing for someone like The Guardian, they'll call me up and say, can you write about this thing that's just happened in science, and can you do it by lunchtime? And I think that's really great, because that really teaches you as a writer to not be precious about it. I think that's the thing that I always feel about writing. You've just got to get on and do it. And sometimes, certainly for book writing, sometimes I will be thinking, this stuff I'm writing is terrible. And I think all writers feel that, and it's probably a bit worrying if you don't. But I know that you just have to get on and do it, and you can go back later and and edit it. But it's the discipline of getting words, figuratively, but it used to be literally on paper, that's the important business. So yeah, that's really what my work consists of now, is balancing the two and finding keeping both of them afloat, as it were. And so I write from ranging from newspapers, as I say, where you're writing for a very general audience, to slightly more specialist stuff in New Scientist and Scientific American, to pretty specialist stuff in fairly technical journals like Nature Materials, where I've had a column for 20 years actually for this year, to occasionally, this has been the really nice thing that I found, that I've been able to keep enough contact with the scientific community to occasionally write scientific papers with colleagues or by myself for the specialist scientific literature. So it spans that whole range.
I'm intrigued how, because you've obviously been very busy doing lots of different things, how you've managed your time and scheduled, and I'm sure there's not been a typical week, but just any insight at all into how you've managed to balance all these different things. You said about waking up at 5 a.m. when you were writing books, and
well, I don't have to do that anymore, fortunately. Again, it is just this thing of getting on and doing it. It's I seem to be able, fortunately, to write quickly, and I'm not quite sure why that is or how that is, but it feels to me like it's just about becoming very focused. When I was working at Nature, and it was in a big open plan office, everything was happening at the same time, and I had to be very, very able to just focus in on what I was doing and not be distracted by everything that was going on around, even though it was great to have all these things going on around. That ability, I guess, served me well there, but it's certainly what I have to do now as a freelance writer, is just to be able to really knuckle down to the task. But it is really just this matter of it's a juggling act. That I know that there's a piece that maybe the deadline is in a couple of days' time, so I've probably got to get going and get cracking on that. But I've got to make sure I find enough time to keep the book ticking over whatever book it is I'm working on, and be looking out for new things to write about. And I suppose it's that routine is just what I've got used to doing. I mean, one thing it does involve at the start of every week is that I look through some of the major scientific journals, what they've published or what they're about to publish, just to keep abreast as much as I can of what's happening in different areas of science. But I think a lot of it is just about having the curiosity to do it, and that's what keeps me doing this. I guess there are some people who decide, I'm going to specialise in this area. I'm going to specialise in space science, for example, or I'm going to specialise in sort of animal behaviour or something. And I understand that motivation, but it's not the one that I have. I've always felt that it's a huge privilege to be able to do what I do and to have the choices that I do. And I really want to make use of that as best I can by learning all the time. Every new project, every new book project that I take on, I really want it to be something where I'm going to learn something new.
Just a few questions about your career in general. What would you say you've enjoyed most about your career?
It's definitely the freedom I have to explore wherever my interest takes me, and I'm constantly feeling grateful for having the opportunity to do that, and just grateful that I've been able to make some kind of living doing that, because it means that what I do can be a constant learning process for me, and that it can it's full of surprises. I don't know where it's going to take me. I mean, another book I wrote was a history of China, but a history of China looked at through China's cultural relationship with water, with how to manage its water resources, with the way that water imagery infuses the language, the philosophy. And I think you could understand a lot about the political history, past and present, of China through that lens. And that's an example of the kind of thing that it was just wonderful to be able to think, right now I've got to find out something about Chinese philosophy. And I spent, before the pandemic, a lot of time in China and have a rudimentary grasp of the language, enough to get around and get a taxi and get a meal, but not more, but enough to give me enough confidence that maybe I can tackle something like this. And it's those sorts of opportunities that I just feel constantly grateful for, to be able to say, actually this is something that intrigues me, so I can now spend a year and a half, 2 years digging into that and scratching that itch and finding out about it.
That's great. What about the most challenging aspect of your job? What's most difficult?
I guess it's always the fear that you have in writing about. So it's not really a fear. It's just it's constantly there, that there's so much potential to get things wrong, to make mistakes, and we're all going to do that. All science communicators are going to do that, So there's no point in fooling ourselves that it's not going to happen. Generally speaking, or in fact, almost across the board, with very few exceptions, scientists are incredibly generous about that. So they're incredibly generous in giving their advice to steer you away from that and to spot mistakes, before they're published, ideally. But if that happens, and something wrong comes out, then they're, almost always really sort of kind about that. And they just sort of say, oh, by the way, you might just like to correct this. They don't get irate about it. So, it's not the worst thing in the world when that happens, but it does mean that you have the potential to kind of make a bit of a fool of yourself, to get things pretty badly wrong. That fortunately doesn't seem to happen too often, and I suppose it's probably a good thing that it breeds humility, that we have to constantly remember how likely we science communicators are to do that. But it means that, and I've just been, literally this morning writing a piece about quantum mechanics that is really hard to get my head around. So that's a hard part of the job, but kind of enjoyably hard, because I like that challenge. I like the fact that I have to work hard and try to dig deep to understand what's going on. So yeah, I guess that's the biggest challenge, but it's not necessarily a bad one.
You've received quite a few awards for all of your efforts over the years. Is there any particular award that has meant the most to you?
Well, the one that probably made a big difference to my confidence, at least, is in 2005. I won. There's a book for. There's a prize for science books in the UK that's awarded every year, and it's generally been awarded via the Royal Society with a sponsor, so it's the big. It's kind of like the Booker of science writing, really. So that's the one that everyone who writes science books, sets their sights on. And so I won it in 2005 to my amazement, and I think to everyone else's amazement, because the shortlist was really quite daunting, the people that were in there. And it was for a book called Critical Mass, which I published the year before, which was a book about how ideas from physics were being used and can be used to understand social phenomena. And I tried to cast this kind of modern social physics really within a historical context, and tracing it back to what philosophers have talked about. And particularly, I started with Thomas Hobbes, that his view of society outlined in Leviathan in the 17th century seemed to me to be a kind of a very early attempt to do something like this, to use rationality and a kind of physics to understand how society works and how government works. So yeah, it was fantastic to receive that, and it meant that Critical Mass suddenly sold very well. Until then it had been doing nothing, and suddenly it was a kind of bestseller for a short time, so that's always very nice. But I think more than that, at that relatively early stage, and I hadn't written so many books by then, and that gave me the confidence to think maybe this is something I can do. That was particularly nice.
Is there any advice you'd give to someone wishing to pursue a career similar to yours?
I mean, I guess when I started doing this in the late 1980s, when I started getting into science communication in a general sense, it wasn't at all professionalised. It was, we all were making it up as we went along. There was no particular training that you could do other than doing it on the job. Whereas today there is, and I think it's a very good thing that there are journalists, science journalism courses and science communication courses that, from what I've seen of them, are very good, and a lot of people coming in new to the profession now have that training and are expected to have that training. And so I'd certainly recommend doing that. It would have saved me from making all kinds of mistakes early on. So yeah, I think that it's very good. It's important to be aware that that's a possibility now, and that it's one that I'd certainly recommend people take if they can.
Final question is, what plans do you have for the future with all of your work?
Well, as I say, I've got the next book written, and that we'll see how that does. And I have a couple of others that I'm working on in various ways. So in a sense, it's sort of going on, doing what I'm doing. But I guess I never quite know which directions my sort of interests are going to take me, but one of them that's emerged from the pandemic is to really be thinking about how science and policy making and politics interact. And I think that we've seen some quite problematic aspects of how that happens everywhere in the world, and certainly in the UK. I think there have been some real problems that the pandemic has highlighted that need to be thought about there. Not just problems in terms of the sort of mechanics of who speaks to whom, But in terms of the whole notion of what science advice to policy should be and what responsibilities scientists who are in that position have, and I guess that's something that actually connects to the book I wrote on, it sounds kind of dramatic to put it this way, but the book I wrote on German physics in the Nazi regime, because there were many questions there to ask about how the physicists interacted with the regime, and there was certainly plenty of collusion that went on there, and collusion that I think partly came about through the scientists kidding themselves that they were living, in this rarefied world that was aloof from politics and society, and so that enabled them to go on working for a murderous genocidal regime. Now, we're not in that, but I think that there are lessons to be learned from episodes like that are extreme cases of the relationships that science does have and can have, and that perhaps sometimes shouldn't have, with the rest of society and with the political context, in which it operates. So that's an area that I'm, very interested in pursuing, really with a view to what we have learned about it from the pandemic.
Philip, thanks so much for speaking. Great to hear about your life.
Pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoyed the Human Podcast, please consider subscribing. I hope to see you soon.